Hello, and welcome to today's webinar titled Planning for Full Participation and Learning in the Inclusive Class, which is presented by Dr. Cheryl M. Jorgensen. We are thrilled you can join us today. This webinar is the first of 3 webinars in our Inclusive Education webinar series, which will feature presentations from 3 outstanding experts in the field of inclusive education. My name is Nicole Eridix, and I am your host for this program, and I am creator of the online resource, The Inclusive Class, and I will be your moderator. Today's webinar is presented by Brooks Publishing Company and The Inclusive Class, which is a website that provides solutions and strategies for teaching all children in inclusive classrooms. Now, before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items to discuss. First, we are recording today's webinar, and a copy of it will be posted after the webinar at www.brookspublishing.com/inclusive-ed-webinars. No need to write down that URL. A copy of it will be included in your post-webinar email. Second, everyone who is attending today's webinar is automatically entered into a drawing to win a free copy of Cheryl's books, The Beyond Access Model and The Inclusion Facilitator's Guide. 3 winners will be selected and notified by email. And finally, Brooks Publishing is extending a special 20% discount on all of Cheryl Jorgensen's books, in addition to posting exclusive free content that Cheryl will mention in her presentation. These items will be included in your post-webinar email as well. Now you will be muted for the webinar, but if you have any questions during Cheryl's presentation, just type them into the question box in your webinar control panel. So without further delay, it is my great pleasure to present today's webinar presenter, Dr. Cheryl Jorgensen. Dr. Cheryl Jorgensen is an inclusive education consultant in private practice after being a project director with the Institute on Disability at the University of New Hampshire, where she was founder of the National Center for Inclusive Education. And she was an assistant research professor in UNH's Education Department from 1985 until 2011. For years, Dr. Jorgensen has worked with youth, teachers, parents, administrators, and communities to increase their commitment to and capacity for including students with disabilities in general education classes. Beginning in 1992, she expanded her focus to include the restructuring of policies, organizational structures, and teaching practices that naturally facilitate inclusion and learning for all students. Dr. Jorgensen publishes extensively in the field and has authored several books, including the Inclusion Facilitator's Guide and the Beyond Access Model. The values that underlie Dr. Jorgensen's work include presuming all students' competence, believing that diversity enhances school community, and encouraging families and schools to work together to promote student success, as well as acknowledging that staff need training, support, and resources to make inclusion successful. I would like to warmly welcome Cheryl to today's webinar, and we look forward to hearing your presentation today.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Nicole, and I really thank Brooks Publishing and you for collaborating to present this series. So, as Nicole said, I have been working in the field of inclusive education. This is actually the beginning of my 30th year. I can hardly believe it. And I'm encouraged when I go out into schools and I see students having fun during their learning, when I see students collaborating and supporting one another, and when I see students fully participating in everything that's going on in the general education classroom. Unfortunately, too often I see examples of what are not really inclusive education at all. And that's sometimes characterized by students with disabilities kind of coming and going throughout the day from the regular education classroom for pull-out instruction or for therapy. I sometimes see a student with a disability clearly separated from the rest of his or her classmates by sitting in the back of the classroom or to the side of the classroom with a paraprofessional. Sometimes I see one student with disabilities working on what appears to be a very different lesson from the rest of the class. I'm pretty dismayed when I see students with disabilities not having a way to communicate during academic instruction or during those times when students are talking with one another about what they did over the weekend, the most popular game that they're playing on their computers. And too often I still see sort of that big dividing line that separates general education from special education, that is sometimes evident by the fact that general educators talk about my students and special educators talk about their students as if they're two entirely separate groups. And a colleague of mine, Doug Bicklin, who just recently retired as the Dean of the School of Education at Syracuse University, called this phenomenon islands in the mainstream. And a particular student that I worked with a number of years ago experienced this phenomenon of being included physically in the general education classroom, but not really being part of everything that was going on. So let me tell you a little bit about this student whose name was Josh. When I first met him, he was just beginning 4th grade. And his educational team, which included his family, said that Josh had been included in grades 1 through 3 quite successfully. The more I got to know Josh, I realized he had a lot of really varied interests. But one thing that he was passionate about was any kind of a machine that flew. And he would actually spend hours looking out of the window trying to spot an airplane or a helicopter because his home was located right next to a local airport. Josh had a label of autism. And again, when I first met him, he did not have a very effective and functioning communication system. He had a couple of signs that he used for I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm all done. He did not use natural speech to communicate like other children. He would sometimes put his middle finger and his index finger together and kind of point at different things in the classroom or point to classmates that he was interested in engaging with. But he certainly did not have a means of communication about academics. Josh got very anxious during transitions and would sometimes display that anxiety by vocalizing his anxiety or by refusing to go to whatever the next activity was. And one of the most fascinating bits of information that was translated to me came out of his recent 3-year reevaluation, in which one of the evaluating professionals said that Josh was functioning at a 2-year-old level. So when I met Josh and his team, they were experiencing, I guess, what I'd call sort of a crisis of confidence about his inclusion in general education. They were asking themselves, and they asked me as an external consultant, if it was really appropriate for Josh to be included in the mainstream of general education. So I was fortunate to be able to work with Josh's team to really help them sort of deal with this crisis that they were experiencing. So the first day that I visited the school, I spent the whole day observing Josh in his new fourth grade classroom. And what I observed is depicted on this slide. So in the left-hand picture, there was the classroom teacher, who's the woman in the gray, looks like a sweatshirt, and the other students who were seated in pairs throughout the classroom. And then in that same picture, in the upper right-hand corner, and I've got kind of a blow-up of what I was seeing here on the slide, was Josh and his paraprofessional. And throughout the day, there would be periods of time when Josh would go over and sit at a desk next to one of the other students. But he did spend most of the day with that paraprofessional at a computer desk off to the side of the classroom. And Josh was just what Doug Bicklin said. He was an island in the mainstream, physically present, but not fully participating. His communication device that his team was trying out allowed him to communicate about actually about 9 different things. He was able to say hi, goodbye, I'm mad, I'm hungry, I have to go to the bathroom, and so forth. And on his communication device, when he pushed or touched one of the squares, one of the 9 squares, it would speak aloud in a digitized voice. However, Josh was not, according to my definition, he was not included. He had definitely a different curriculum, and his instruction was provided solely by his paraprofessional or by his special education teacher, his speech pathologist, or his OT. He had very few learning experiences with other students in the classroom. He certainly did not have a way to communicate about academics or about those age-appropriate social topics that we know our kids are talking about a lot in our classrooms. He was pulled out of the general ed class for over 50% of the day and therefore missed large segments of general education instruction. He might return to the classroom when the students were in the middle of reading a book or when they were almost to the end of a math lesson. Part of my sort of determination that Josh's situation did not really represent inclusive education is that his team had no common planning time during the week or even on a monthly basis to think about how Josh might be more fully included. His services seemed to be disjointed. Again, the team was really questioning the wisdom of his being in that 4th grade classroom at all. His social relationships with other students in the classroom were very fleeting. The students were certainly kind to Josh. They said hello to him in the morning. They would willingly sit next to him at lunch. They would play with him at recess, but they were not having meaningful conversations. And the students and Josh really did not have any contexts in which to get to know one another, to understand one another's interests. And his paraprofessional was really the one responsible for providing all instruction in the general education classroom. And that instruction consisted primarily of what are called discrete learning trials that had been developed by a behavior therapist who was also consulting to Josh's educational program. So when the other kids were engaged in a language arts lesson that had, something to do about a 4th grade book that they had read, Josh was identifying the letters of the alphabet with his paraprofessional seated right next to him at that little desk over to the side of the classroom. So when I was, after I had gotten to know Josh through a couple of observations, after talking with each and every member of his team, certainly including his mom and dad, I recommended a series of steps that they could take in order to really help them gather enough information to make really an informed decision about whether it was appropriate or even feasible for Josh to be successfully included in that general education classroom. And I suggested these things that I'm really going to sort of play out for you how they happen throughout the rest of the webinar. So the number one suggestion was that Josh's team presume and actively construct his competence. And again, I'll tell you more about what that really looked like in a moment. I suggested and I worked with the team, the school administrators, to make sure that the team had weekly, uninterrupted, sacred planning time for related to Josh's educational program and his inclusion. I worked with his speech language pathologist and his OT to really upgrade his communication system so that he did have a way to communicate about what was going on in that class every minute of the day. We worked a lot on assuring that Josh had accessible instructional materials, which is a requirement of the U.S. federal special education law. I sat in on those weekly planning meetings and taught his team how to plan for what Josh's participation would look like during academic instruction. And I'm going to share with you the process that the team went through to do that kind of planning. And in the follow-up email that you're going to get after this webinar, you'll be provided not only with some and a couple of articles that I wrote about inclusive education, but also with the short team planning form that I'm going to show you during the webinar. I also spent a great deal of time talking with Josh's special education teacher, his speech pathologist, and his occupational therapist about what their role would be in that general education classroom in order to support Josh's participation and learning. And in this particular school, Josh's special education teacher had the title of inclusion facilitator. And if you have had a chance to read anything that I've written, or if you have a chance to acquire the Inclusion Facilitator book, you'll read about how that role really is an important strategy to support the inclusion of students who have more intensive support needs. So let's talk about that very first recommendation that I made, which was for the team to presume Josh's competence really kind of regardless of what the results of that evaluation was that said he was functioning at a 2-year-old level. Because to be honest with you, if that were a report that I read about a 4th grade student, I would be asking the same question that Josh's teacher was. She was essentially saying, if this student is essentially a 2-year-old, does it really make sense for him to be in 4th grade? Can I teach him 4th grade information? Can he learn 4th grade concepts? So I owe a great deal of credit to another colleague of mine named Anne Donnellan, who said that it is the least dangerous assumption to presume that if a student is being provided with high-quality instruction and supports, he or she is competent to learn and to communicate about age-appropriate general education curriculum in the general education classroom. So there are 5 reasons that I've sort of evolved over the years in my working with students that um, that really provide a rationale for why presuming competence is one of my core values and one of my core practices. And the first one is a quote from a scholar named James Rem. And he said, simply put, when teachers expect students to do well and show intellectual growth, they do. And when teachers do not have such expectations, performance and growth are not so encouraged and may in fact be discouraged in a variety of ways. The second rationale for presuming all students' competence is that research has shown us that traditional assessments of people with disabilities are seriously flawed. They may not be valid nor reliable. And those assessments that purport to measure intelligence or adaptive behavior really usually point out what people can't do rather than what they might be able to do with the right supports. So whenever I see an evaluation that identifies the IQ or the intelligence of a student with a significant disability, particularly one who has difficulty communicating, I take those evaluation results with a, I don't know, with a big grain of salt. Not only does research show us that some of these evaluations that we use are flawed, but it's really showing that a growing number of children and adults have been labeled, quote, retarded or cognitively impaired, are able to show more competence than we ever thought possible when they have a means to communicate. So the fourth rationale for why I think presuming competence is an important value and an important practice is because to presume incompetence could really result in harm to our students if we are wrong about that presumption. And finally, the fifth rationale is sort of just the flip side of number 4, and that is even if we're wrong about students' capacities to learn the general ed curriculum, the consequences of that presumption being wrong are not as dangerous as the alternative. So once Josh's team agreed to presume his competence, and I really said to them, I said, I really don't expect you tomorrow to come into school and all of a sudden just totally shift your understanding. But what I would like to suggest is that I'd like to suggest that for a bit of time, while we are exploring and trying out new supports for Josh, new supports in the area of communication and new supports to enable him to more actively participate in the instruction, that I said that would sort of mean that we're going to make every effort to uncover or to construct his competence by providing him with supports to participate and with a way to communicate. And his team agreed to do that, in part because they knew that they were going to be getting some support, some professional development, and some coaching along the way. And again, when I began the webinar, or when Nicole gave the introduction, she said that one of my core principles in working with schools, and I think it's a core principle that should be active in every school, is certainly I think the expectation should be that educators are skilled in including students with more significant disabilities, but also there is both a professional and an ethical obligation for administrators to provide the supports that educators need in order to do their best work. So around the issue of providing Josh with a specific and a very new set of communication supports are a couple of principles. And the first is really straightforward, and that is all students communicate. They may not communicate at the present time in ways that that are connected to the particular curriculum that's going on in their classroom or in ways that we can easily understand, but all students communicate. And if students do not communicate in ways that are commensurate or that are kind of on par with their same age classmates who don't have disabilities, that those students really need what are called augmentative communication systems and supports. And that means all students, even those students who do not yet demonstrate communicative intent, who do not demonstrate a reliable yes or no response, and even students who have not yet shown us that they have conventional literacy. We cannot wait a minute for any reason to provide all students with a way to communicate. And in fact, it's through their communication abilities and the ways that we communicate with them that we build students' abilities to indicate yes or no, that we build students' literacy and social skills. So we made a dramatic shift in the kind of communication device and supports that Josh had. He went from using a communication device that gave him 9 options to communicate with one that looked like the one that's on your screen right now. He had a new communication device that had some core vocabulary in terms of nouns, verbs, places, and people. And he also had a number of folders, which you could actually see right there on the bottom of this communication display, that when those folders were tapped, would open up new sets of vocabulary that were relevant to English language arts, mathematics, science, social studies, recess, art, music, and so on. And the next slide is a picture of Josh having his communication device available in a language arts activity with 3 other students in his small group. Not only did Josh have his communication device, but you can sort of see in back of him on his desk, he has the same book that other students are reading for this language arts activity. And he also had an adapted version of that book. And the book was called Maniac McGee. And what I taught his team members to do is to either find an already adapted version of that book on the internet, and Google searches are your friend when you're looking for accessible instructional materials, and I taught them to be able to create an adapted book for the same things that other students were reading in the classroom. And what we did is we rewrote the book kind of down at the 1st or 2nd grade reading level. We maintained all the essential story elements, and we added in to the text small pictures or symbols that were similar to the pictures and symbols and words that he had on his communication device. So now Josh had a piece of text that was that really represented sort of our best guess at what his reading level would be, but we kind of hedged our bets because we also provided him with those pictures and symbols with which we knew he had some familiarity. So again, just another picture of Josh reading his adapted book, and he was often provided with support from his paraprofessional, from a reading buddy, from the speech pathologist, who you could actually see in the background, who came into the classroom now to deliver her supports to Josh. One of the next major steps that I worked with Josh's team around was how to really consider exactly the kinds of supports that Josh would need for participating not only in those small group ELA activities, but in the other kind of lessons and teaching routines that happened throughout the course of the typical week. These questions, I'm going to give you the details behind them in just a moment, but when you get your follow-up email, these are the ones that are represented on the planning form that you'll receive. And the 5 questions are: what are the learning objectives in this lesson for all students? What are the priority learning objectives for the focus student, or in this case for Josh? And how will those learning objectives be assessed? What supports does Josh need to fully participate in the lesson, in those instructional routines? What IEP objectives will we focus on? And then what accessible instructional materials will need to be either found, created, or adapted? And the planning form also asks that teams indicate who is actually going to be responsible for developing those adapted or modified assessments and for acquiring or developing those accessible materials. Because, you know, the sort of greatest plan in the world can fall apart if the student doesn't have those materials at what is essentially the same time as other students have their instructional materials. So let's just go through it, through the planning form for a particular language arts lesson. Question number 1. And this is not the order in which things are taught to the student, but these are the questions that the team talks about during their planning meeting. And the form that you'll be getting is sort of fully adaptable and customizable for your purposes. So I suggest that somebody in the team volunteer to take notes during the planning meeting, and that brief bullet point notes just be entered right into the form and saved as a unique document for that particular team meeting. And then a new blank form can come up, can be used the next time the team engages in planning. So question number 1, what are the learning objectives for the class? And we really just want the highlights. So the general ed teacher says, okay, over the course of the next few lessons this week, students are going to be able to describe the dispositions and skills of a good writer. I'm going to have each student, since this is the beginning of the year, really identify one personal goal that they have around the area of literacy and one goal for their social emotional learning. I want, by the end of this week, all my students to be able to describe the elements of a 3-paragraph persuasive essay, and we're really going to begin writing those essays. And we're also going to begin to develop a character study based on the Maniac McGee book. So now that we have that kind of basic information about what other students are doing, we can now plan for Josh's learning objectives and his participation within that general education framework. And some of you participating today may be familiar with the fact that all states obviously have to develop learning objectives, learning standards for all students in their state, and that all states also have to develop learning standards for students with the most significant disabilities. And those learning standards need to be strongly aligned with general education learning. So, 20 years ago, I worked with a lot of students who might have, I'm just pulling up a real-life example, a math goal related to counting the number of cans of soup on a shelf in a kitchen in a classroom. That's really no longer an appropriate math goal. Students' goals, even students who we think have the most significant disabilities, need to really be strongly aligned with the same learning objectives as other students, with the recognition that we may need to modify those goals in their depth, their breadth, and their complexity. So here we have question number 2 that the team discussed during their planning meeting. What are the learning objectives for Josh? How will they be assessed? And who will prepare those assessments? And I like to kind of divide the learning objectives question into 3 different areas. Are there any big ideas or enduring understandings that we want Josh to have? What is the content area vocabulary from these ELA lessons that we want Josh to acquire? And is there some specific knowledge, content, facts, or skills? And I'm not going to read each of them to you on the webinar today, but you may be able to review these and look at them in a little more depth by reviewing the webinar after it's over. But we went right down the list and identified some learning objectives. We talked about some modified assessments, and we made sure to indicate who was going to prepare those assessments. We talked, we had Josh's IEP right next to us, and we'd actually created just a matrix of all of Josh's learning objectives by typing them into the left-hand column of this form. And then what we did is we just typed in all the different activities that would happen during a typical day, and we were able to put a checkbox into the English Language Arts lesson that let every team member know which of Josh's IEP objectives, in addition to the academic and core content learning objectives, we would focus on. And we just kind of looked at this as kind of a check on ourselves so that we wouldn't forget which of his IEP objectives we needed to focus on. Question number 4. We really kind of broke down some of the common, and I call them instructional routines, that teachers use over the course of their teaching, day after day, week after week. And we took a look at what it would look like for Josh to really be fully participating in those routines. And we used this form that has 4 columns to kind of plan that out. So, for example, in 4th grade, students were getting used to taking notes when the teacher delivered information. So, what does that look like for students without disabilities? Well, it looks like they're sitting in their chairs, they're looking up at the smartboard as the teacher's lecturing and presenting information, they're asking clarifying questions, they're raising their hands and offering information. For each of those bullet points in the 2nd column, we talked about the supports that Josh would need in order to participate. And you could glance at them there and again review them in more depth later on. And then again we keep returning to this question: who is going to prepare those supports? And we certainly did not have an opportunity in one planning meeting to plan out Josh's supports for participation in all these, typical classroom routines such as partner work, small group work, reading activities, research projects. But over the course of the first couple of weeks of school, we did plan out. And we made essentially what were support plans for Josh's participation. So here's a little, a broken out example of how we thought about this issue of full participation, which of course is one of the foundations of learning. So there's my boy Josh. There's Josh's teacher saying, oh my gosh, how is he going to participate? Because we don't really know if he's reading, he doesn't speak, he has autism, he's a fourth grader. What is he really going to do during independent silent reading? So the first thing we ask, and again, here is column number 2 in this planning form. What are all kids doing? Well, you can see they're sitting in a circle, they're looking at books, they're holding the book right, we can see them tracking with their eyes, turning pages, they're making comments and asking questions. Josh, he needs an adapted book. He needs his communication device to be programmed with vocab and messages about the book and the reading process. He may need to have a little sensory tool with him to help him manage his sensory challenges. And if this activity goes for over 30 minutes, he's probably going to need a stretch break or a walk-around break just to help him get his wiggles out. So there he is. Josh is reading silently his adapted book. He is not using natural speech to communicate, but we began to notice him vocalizing the syllables of individual words. So if he was reading Josh reading silently, we would hear him doing this. Huh, ha, 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 ha. The last question that the team addressed during their weekly planning sessions was about this issue of accessible instructional materials. And the ones that I've put across the top of this grid are just the ones that were pretty typical for this fourth grade. Again, if you're teaching high school, if you're teaching preschool, you can customize this form for the materials, the learning tools that are used in the classrooms that you work in. So we also obviously needed to address the question of how do we assess what Josh is learning. And the first thing that's important to assess, even before we begin to ask ourselves, you know, can he identify words? Can he write? Is to really evaluate what's called the fidelity of implementation of our instruction and of those supports that we so carefully planned. In other words, we need to ask ourselves, did we deliver the planned instruction and the supports accurately and consistently? And then we can assess Josh's performance. And that we always need to remember that when we're assessing kids with these most significant disabilities, we need to remember to provide them with the same supports during those assessments as we provide to them during instruction. And when our fidelity of implementation is high, we can then have greater confidence that our student's performance is really representative of his abilities. You know, if we just didn't get around to creating that adapted book, then we probably better not count Josh's score on the reading test because he didn't have the supports that he needed in order to do his best work. And you know, if our student doesn't demonstrate performance or learning in a way that reflects our high expectations, we go back to the drawing board and we try new supports. My colleague Ann Donnellan, who came up with this idea of the least dangerous assumption, said that when we presume our students' competence, it means that problems of student learning are presumed to be problems of instruction and not reflective of inherent student deficits. And this is also one of those guiding principles of response to intervention. If our students are not learning, then it is incumbent upon us as committed teachers to begin to try other supports, whether those are different kinds of ways of delivering that universal core instruction to all students, or whether or not we just need to begin to specialize instruction for small groups of students or even for the individual student. So before we go into our questions and answers, I'm just going to do a quick wrap up here. There is over a 30-year history, I would say, of research related to how we can effectively teach and include students with more significant disabilities. And that research has shown us that there are actually some negative effects of not including students with significant disabilities in heterogeneous general education classrooms. When we segregate students in self-contained classrooms, substantially separate classrooms, or even separate schools, we're really perpetuating that culture of an us and them. There's research that shows that students with significant disabilities receive poorer quality instruction in academics in self-contained classrooms compared to inclusive classrooms. Those students whose placement is in separate classrooms have poorer quality IEPs. They have great difficulty generalizing their learning to regular environments, either in their school or in their communities. We disrupt the natural opportunities for social relationships to develop. And we tend not only to segregate students, but we end up putting our professionals and our professional expertise into silos so that we put all the people who know about assistive technology in special ed classrooms rather than inclusive classrooms. We put all the people who know about language development in those separate classrooms rather than in general ed classrooms where they can be resources to all our students. General ed teachers who don't have a wide variety of students in their classes actually find that their confidence decreases for teaching diverse learners. And the sort of last negative effect of segregation is that it puts a condition on belonging. It says that students who have particular labels need to perform in a certain way in order to be part of the vibrant mainstream of school life. On the flip side, research has shown a number of benefits of inclusive education. And what I've done is provided you with three major internet sources, internet websites that not only summarize in bullet points what the research is around inclusive education, but really provide you with information about how those research studies were conducted and the opportunity for you to read and share that research. So a colleague of mine, Wayne Saylor from the University of Kansas, is working on a fascinating project in a number of states around the U.S. that's called SWIFT, S-W-I-F-T. You can Google it. And what Dr. Saylor and his colleagues and all the folks he's working with is finding that there's even a growing body of scientific evidence suggested that integrated or inclusive service models for students with disabilities enhance educational outcomes for all students. And at the end of the day, I love this quote by my colleague Mara Sapone-Shevin from Syracuse University, and she says that inclusion is not about disability, nor is it only about schools. Inclusion demands that we ask, what kind of world do we want to create? What kinds of skills and commitment do people need to thrive in a diverse society? And by embracing inclusion as a model of social justice, we can create a world fit for all of us. So I'm going to now turn it over to Nicole, who will facilitate and share with me some questions that you may have had, and I'll be glad to try to answer them in the last 10 minutes of the webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Cheryl. That was so informative. And we do have a question here from one of our participants, Bethany Voss, who asks, what is the exact role of the general education teacher during this time in the day when the student is working on their adaptive materials? There's an aid there. What should the general education teacher be doing at that point?
Wonderful question. Um, I do not mean this to sound like a flip answer, but the general education teacher should include Josh in all the classroom discussions, should make sure to hand out all the learning materials and worksheets and papers that she's handing out to other students, and should definitely call on Josh, sort of at the same, the same number of times that she typically calls on other students. And it's the role of the paraprofessional to be, I guess I could say, kind of manipulating Josh's support materials in a way so that when he's called on, he can get to the right page or the right part of his communication device to answer the teacher's question. Like, and here's an example. Josh, could you share with us your favorite part of Maniac McGee? Paraprofessional quickly supports Josh, if he doesn't already know how to do it, to pop up one of the pages on his communication device that says, my favorite part is when Maniac McGee was living with the, and I can't remember the family's name, and eating what the deer ate. So the classroom teacher's responsibility is to include him, speak to him, question him in the same way that she's doing with other students.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, here's a question that I've noticed from, or have had from many people and on this webinar as well. Why does there seem to be just pockets of inclusive schools here and there? Why hasn't the practice scaled up on more of a statewide or national level if we know that research and obviously our observations indicate inclusion is best for all?
Yeah, that's a complicated question to answer, and I've been asking myself that question for 30 years, and here's my best guess. One is that inclusive education for students with significant disabilities is not something that we were taught when we went to college. Most general ed teachers had one class that might not even have talked about students with autism, students with, who don't communicate using natural speech. So the vast majority of teachers and other professionals in schools today, including principals and superintendents, do not, they don't come to their job with the expectation nor with the skills. And so what we've relied on is really professional development. And I guess like any innovation, they tend to start in certain places, and I don't know why it hasn't spread in a broad way to lots of schools, but I can tell you in the schools that I've worked in and ones that I know of that are not yet adopting inclusive practices, one of the major factors is the school principal. So is that school principal taking it upon him or herself to go to conferences, to join professional organizations that relate to inclusive education, and then bringing that information back to his or her faculty and providing the material resources and the professional development resources. So I think it's all about principals and principal leadership at the end of the day.
Now, what about at the high school level? I know that the example that you gave us was an elementary student, and I hear that inclusion, and I've seen inclusion work very well at the elementary school level. We have a participant who asks, what about at the high school level? How does one manage 7 different classes and a different prep period? Do you have any models of inclusion at that level?
Yes, and I'm going to suggest that our Brooks host and Nicole maybe write down a couple of these resources for folks to share with in the follow-up email, just in case folks don't get them. I'm going to recommend two books for people, and then I'm just going to chat out the issue of high school inclusion for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
There's a book whose primary author is Douglas Fisher, F-I-S-H-E-R,
Mm-hmm.
and it's called Inclusive High Schools. And in that book, I believe, are 7 examples of inclusive high schools from all different parts of the U.S. And how they have looked at what really are, and I agree with you, the unique demands, the unique challenges and structures of high schools that are very different from elementary and middle schools. I also wrote a book about inclusive high schools, which happens to be out of print, but I own the rights to it, and it's called Restructuring High Schools for All Students. And I would be glad to send the whole book in PDF form to anyone who wants it
Wonderful.
for a small charge of $20. Um, I'm going to address just as succinctly as I can the one specific question that our participant asked. At the high school level, the role of the special education teacher as inclusion facilitator takes on a bit of a different look. And the collaborative teaming process tends to be different because I've just probably never been in a high school where you can pull together all 7
Mm-hmm.
teachers that a student has into that planning meeting. So what I recommend is that the inclusion facilitator or the special ed teacher has a 15-minute meeting with the English teacher, the science teacher, the social studies, or, math teacher once a week or once every other week to gather that initial information about what's going to be taught in upcoming lessons. And that with that information, and I'm going to refer to it as that column 2 information, or, from our planning form, what is it that all students are going to be learning? What are the learning objectives, or in column 1 of the other part of the form? And
Mm-hmm.
that information is brought to a lengthy, that 1-hour planning meeting with the speech pathologist, the SPED teacher, the paraprofessional, so they can then get into the nitty-gritty of the special supports for the students' participation in those lessons. And I guess the final word I'll say about high school inclusion is that I believe and research supports that we need to keep students with the most significant disabilities in high school involved in academics and all the other rich learning opportunities that high school presents right up through the 12th grade, or in Canada, is it still grade 13?
Ontario.
Okay.
In Ontario, yeah,
That we
as far as
need
I
to
know.
keep, we need to keep kids really engaged in academics and extracurriculars until that graduation ceremony. And then between the ages of 18 and 21, or whatever it is for your state or province, it's during those years that we think about and we involve students in post-secondary education, in community-based learning that will then promote their ability to live to their greatest degree of independence in inclusive communities when they leave school.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cheryl. And it's unfortunate that we've run out of time because we've just had so many great questions come in, and very valid questions. And I'm sorry that we didn't get a chance to get to all of them. But if you do have a question for Cheryl Jorgensen, she does have a website that you can go to and type in your question, and that is www.cherylmjorgensen.com. And if you type her question, she will get back to you as soon as she can. Now, on behalf of our guests today, Cheryl Jorgensen, as well as Brooks Publishing and the Inclusive class, I would like to thank you all for taking the time to view this very informative webinar. Please don't forget to sign up for our next webinar, which will be on Thursday, September 25th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we will be having presenter Whitney Rapp join us, who will be discussing ways to support behavior in the inclusive class. I just wanted to wish everyone a wonderful day and thank you for joining us. Goodbye.